A very good evening to all the viewers. Thank you for joining us on this Thursday evening for the evening review. My name is Taiwan Jabela, your host. Today we are talking all things labor, but let's go for a quick commercial break and revert. Tonight on the show, we are joined by Herbert Jauch. He is a veteran labor law expert, and he is here to talk to us about a host of labor issues, particularly the current standoff between public servants and the government. Herbert, thank you very much for making time again. It's your first time on the show this year.
Yes, this is the first time.
Very good, because so much is going on. I should have had you 5 times already. Might be if it was paid, the events as they occur, I'm sure I would have had you a lot of times here. But thank you for being here for the first time this year, Herbert. Give us your sense of that situation that I just spoke about, which is that there's now a deadlock officially between the unions representing civil servants and government. What does it mean? What is the background to this?
Yes. I think we're seeing now a coming together of the economic crisis that has been a few years in the making, and the frustrations of workers that are so exposed to it and feel like unprotected, let down, their hopes being dashed, and just being given promises of a better tomorrow, but concretely either struggling with being unemployed or just having casual employment. Others have maybe a job but are stuck in low wages. And with the civil servants, who used to be amongst the better paid employees countrywide compared to many others, it's now been a situation where, after the previous finance minister had promised that it might be difficult for government to give salary increases, but that they would at least receive inflation adjustments. In other words, if inflation is 5%, then the wages would be adjusted by 5%. Now, that hasn't happened for the last 5-6 years already. And it seems this year's negotiation also went basically going through the motions. Government and the recognized unions met, and again, no outcome. And I think we're reaching a boiling point now where civil servants are just fed up with this happening, because it's not a situation where government would say, well, we can't give you anything this year, but next year we will. It's now a situation where several years their salaries have remained the same. And that means, when you take inflation into account, that they actually earn less in terms of spending power. They lost between 20 and 30% of their spending power. So civil servants and their households are actually getting poorer. And that must be a worrying sign. And for the unions concerned, it's a very difficult situation, because they know on the one hand they have a clear mandate from their members, and on the other hand they deal with an employer who says, well, there is no money, we can't give you any of the demands. We can't give in to any of the demands you raised. So it's a very volatile situation. It's frustrating, certainly for the unions and for civil servants generally. And it points to really a kind of a lack of strategy on government side, because they knew this issue would be coming. And my sense is at the moment that civil servants feel really let down.
Indeed. and you describe the situation as volatile, which is true, Herbert. And my fear is when we are at the stage where we are now, the unions and the employer, they call it There's a certificate, it's called what? The
Unresolved dispute.
unresolved dispute. Technically, what does it mean when that is issued?
Maybe the whole process of collective bargaining. There is 2-3 components. The first one is that a registered union, registered with the Office of the Labour Commissioner, gains the majority of employees as their members. Yeah. So in the civil servants, if that's the bargaining unit, then half of the civil servant plus one need to be member of that union or group of unions. Then, once that is achieved, they sign what is called a recognition agreement. A recognition agreement basically means the employer says, I recognize this union or these unions as the representative of my staff, and we will now negotiate annually or biannually conditions of employment with them. So then the unions go to their members, get a mandate, and they start negotiating. Now, when they reach an agreement, they sign the agreement, it's legally binding, and it's going to be implemented. If not, you declare a dispute, and that's what has happened now in the civil service. Declaring a dispute goes to the employer to say, we will not accept what you've offered us, and the union gives a copy to the Office of the Labour Commissioner. Then comes the process of conciliation, where kind of a mediator is appointed to bring the two parties together within a period of 30 days to try and find a solution. If that, again, doesn't succeed, then it remains an unresolved dispute, and the certificate is issued by the Office of the Labour Commissioner. Then the union usually goes back to their members and says, look, this is the scenario. Do you want to go on strike, holding a strike ballot, or is there something else that we should do now? And these are the steps that lead then what by law is called a protected strike, a strike where you can't be dismissed of, similar to what we've seen others like at NBC and others in the past.
And that is what is scary, Herbert. That what if the unions go back to report back to their members, as you stated, and then the members give the union that mandate to say we are now going to embark on a protected strike. I mean, can we even remotely contemplate a situation like that? Because I imagine you would have, of course, your essential services workers like your doctors staying at work, but can we contemplate even a situation where almost the entire public service is shut down?
Exactly, and this is a scenario we might be facing when the anger and frustration boil over. And we've seen that happening in many of our neighboring countries over the years, in Africa generally, when with the advent of structural adjustment program, where IMF and the World Bank basically told governments, well, in exchange for our loans, there mustn't be personnel cost expenditure. So you mustn't increase what you spend on civil service. In some countries like DRC, there were massive retrenchments. In Zimbabwe, when that happened in the 90s, there was a massive friction between unions and government. So we wouldn't be the first country. But when it happens, it has very severe impacts. It's not only the short term of an administration coming to an end, it's then also the question, how will it be resolved? And if it that isn't resolved quickly with an outcome that's acceptable to the civil servant, you have the danger of a complete demoralization setting in, that people trickle back to work, even more demoralized because they usually don't get paid during a strike. So they already lose income, then go back with a dissatisfaction of having an outcome that's below what they expected. And it could lead to all kinds of repercussion also in terms of service delivery in the public service, when you have thousands of civil servants that are frustrated. And I think it's a very volatile situation, and if it happens, it will cause severe problems. This is not a short-term crisis that can be quickly glossed over. And it's a bit surprising that government just thought they can year after year just go into negotiations to say, well, there is no money, do and say whatever you want, there is no money. That is, it's not negotiation in good faith. It basically provokes a backlash, and it provokes a dispute. And it could become very costly for Namibia because the civil service is very huge. There were already concerns about delivery, about efficiency in the civil service. If now you have that mixed with a sense of injustice and discontent, it could really undermine the effectiveness of public service delivery.
Yeah, and before you go on a break, Herbert, again, I mean, truly, government doesn't have money. It's not a figment of imagination or anything of the sort. But there are people who are saying, a teacher in Okongo or a nurse in Karasberg saying, look, we cannot be sacrificial lambs of the failing regime in Windhoek. Some of them would say that because we say, look, there's no money, but it's because maybe our resources are not managed correctly, or the planning of how to spend our resources is not being done correctly. Why are we being punished for things that are happening in Windhoek? What options does government have then? Are they going to borrow money, which is very unsustainable, to borrow money to fund these demands? Or do you put on hold some of the capital projects to reserve money for that? What are the options?
Exactly. And the sad thing is really, during our time in the Union, since the 1990s, we have said, look, you must watch your debt, you must watch it running out of control, and you must especially watch what happens when you have to turn to the IMF and World Bank for loans, when your cash flow is under strain, like ours is now. And there were dozens of countries in Africa that have gone through that. And so it's a bit shocking that we wide-eyed walked into the same problem. We just needed to ask Zimbabwe, what happened in the 1990s in Zimbabwe, when the big break came between ZANU as the ruling party and the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Union as the large labor federation, who were close allies all the years. They broke over precisely that when Zimbabwe went into their structural adjustment program. And what the lesson for that is always had to be, avoid getting there in the first place. Once you're entrapped, once you're in a situation like we are now, it's very difficult to get out of it. And I've seen the agreement that the Namibian government and the IMF signed, for example, I think it was last year or 2 years ago, which clearly says Namibia undertakes to contain the wage expenditure, basically saying we're not going to increase wages. So you made an agreement with the IMF on the one hand, and then you go and face your unions and you try and gloss over it, and it's a recipe for disaster. And for many years, for example, the finance ministry always said debt levels must be retained at around 30% of the GDP. But long before COVID, we shot up to over 60% and 70% now. Now, that's where the problem originates. Now it's really crisis management. And like you said, it's now looking at the budget overall, looking at the give and take, but also politicians and members of parliament, etc. They must look at their own privileges and understand how hugely privileged they are in result to everyone else. And they can't sit on high horses and say, tighten your belt, when they live a life of luxury and secure and high incomes, whereas others are not. And I think this is the dilemma that they're facing now. There's a moral dilemma, there's an economic dilemma, and it requires now to put really the cards on the table openly and say, what can we do within these constraints? It's very unfortunate that we got there and that government actually didn't heed the warning signs that were there. And even their own targets, like 30% of GDP as the limit to debt, they threw it out and doubled it within 3 years. And this is, for me, hard to understand. If you have such expenditure, there must be positive outcomes in terms of social and economic development. You can't have a debt increase like that while having a continuous growth of unemployment like we had. And I think this is where it is a dilemma that has been built over some years. And now it's crisis management, and it will be a hard sell all around, because as you said, government is under strain now financially. The finance minister has clear instruction to keep to budget lines. But civil servants who have already lost 20-30% of their spending power, they expect something to happen. So there is no quick fix solution. It requires now openness and ways of cutting some unnecessary expenditure and re-looking at the budget. And there's really no magic wand that government can use now. It's truly a pity that we've allowed ourselves to end up in such a scenario.
Indeed. We go for a quick break and return with Herbert Jauch. We continue our conversation. Herbert, you mentioned something profound, which I've been personally observing for a long time, and I've spoken about it in my editorials on this show and other platforms. And it is about how our debts have gotten out of hand. What scares me personally is that there isn't clear evidence of how this money was spent. You can't say that we have necessarily really forged ahead development-wise as a country from point A to B in the past, say, 5 or 6 years to justify this kind of borrowing. And I have seen politicians every year saying, 30% was always our national sort of understanding of GDP. And then when we were at about 40%, they were saying, no, we are still within the SADC, the prescribed SADC limit. And then it goes on and say, no, we are still within the global limit for developing countries. I mean, is this the crisis that we are sitting on now? Is it sort of our own creation?
To some extent, it is, and it's precisely how you described it. We were one of the few countries that were lucky that at independence, or shortly thereafter, when Mandela became president in South Africa, where he then said, well, the debt that Namibia has on paper to South Africa, we will write off because we can't expect Namibians to pay for their own oppression. So it was a profound understanding that this debt cannot be justified. And Namibia was presented basically with a clean slate. And that gave us a wonderful opportunity to stay away from that. Then when it was around 30%, it was still very manageable. But now you look already in the budget, what portion of the budget goes just to interest payment on debt and debt repayment. And that portion grows every year. So soon we'll be over 10% of our national budget just going to debt payments, and it continues. What then happens, as you spend more and more on debt, you have to borrow again to pay for the previous loan and for the interest you failed to pay last time around. So you run into the debt spiral. And there it is, for me, really unacceptable, the way you accurately described it, when politicians said, but we're still within that framework. Look at what happened in our neighboring countries. Look at how the Malawis, the Zambias, the Zimbabwe's, the Angolas, Nigeria, Ghana, etc. You go across the continent, Kenya, how they all suffered under those conditions that came with high indebtedness and loans from the IMF and the World Bank. And there are dozens of case studies that we had available in the 1990s already when our debt level was low. So we should not have said, it's fine, we'll get there where they are. No, we should have said no. Lesson from history, don't get there.
Exactly.
Make sure this does not happen, so that we keep the space, that we rather are able to set our own spending priorities rather than being dictated to as loan conditionalities. And I think that lesson we've just thrown out the window. And when the time came, when we moved beyond the 30%, there was not a rethink to say, hold it, for what did we spend the money? What are luxuries that we can't afford? And in Namibia, for example, the tragic ending that we've seen, years before that, there were already the warning signs that you can't pump in every year 200 million, 500 million to save an airline. You must develop a strategy of how to make the airline sustainable, similar to the way Ethiopian Airlines, for example, has managed. So you become selective, you have a strategy, and you make it work. But you can't go on 10, 20 years of hundreds of millions every year as bailouts when nothing improves. And that was a bit of a symbol. We went on and on and on thinking, according to international frameworks, compared with our neighbors, we're doing okay. But that was not good enough. We should have said, we want to make sure that we don't get there. And it's only now that we're sitting in the middle of it that we're seeing these implications, and the results are quite similar to what we have had elsewhere. So that is where, unfortunately, one has to ask the political leadership, did you not take it seriously? What happened elsewhere? Did you think it would be somehow differently in Namibia? Or did you just not see any other way of doing things? And that would be a tragedy. And unfortunately, at the moment, it looks like we're falling right into the trap.
Yeah.
And the budget consultations, for example, with the Minister of Finance earlier this year in the run-up to the national budget was basically, well, make your proposals, but it mustn't cost anything. Simplified. So what is it? And it's almost like going into wage negotiations now with the unions also. Make your proposals, but it mustn't cost us anything. You know, you can't run a country, you can't deal with an economic crisis and have a turnaround strategy and at the same time make sure that households don't slide further into economic crisis with just cutting off the tap. So these austerity measures that we are taking now are unlikely to solve it and are more likely to present new problems. And at the same time, it's also true what you said, expenditure that doesn't have immediate and visible positive results that we simply can't afford anymore.
Yeah. My last question then to you, Herbert, is obviously one of the things again that scared me at the beginning of this financial year was when we were told that there will be no new development projects embarked upon, that there's nothing new that we're going to start as a country for the entire financial year. Funding will only be availed to projects that are already running. That is so scary. What are our options? You spoke about our neighboring countries, the Malawis of this world, how they have struggled to get out of the situation that they find themselves in up to now. Is there any opportunity at all for us to then say, okay, we are here now, but let's dig ourselves out of the ditch that we are in?
Well, there are two angles at which one can approach it. The one is the poverty angle, to say we must lift people out of this poverty, and in that process create economic activities, localized, small scale, not big bang. So the green hydrogen is another approach. It looks at a future industry, huge foreign investment, but that doesn't speak to this current reality. So we need to complement futuristic ideas and industries for the future with interventions we can do here and now. And one of our previous discussions we had was on the housing issues and how a housing program is one of the interventions that could generate a whole lot of economic activities along the chain. So build the housing construction materials produced locally. And with such a backlog that we have, you can have an intervention that that would make a significant difference, provide tens of thousands of new jobs on an ongoing basis, and leads to also a greater beneficiation. Now, finally, some African leaders have put a stop to unprocessed raw materials. That should have been done decades ago. And Namibia should have been on that. The unprocessed raw materials will not be just dug up and exported from the country. So these ideas that have been talked about all the time but not implemented, we need to implement them now very, very urgently and very systematically. And it's a pity that we had in the past interventions like TIPEC, this targeted program for economic growth and employment creation, which in the end created, despite huge expenditure, just like 15,000 permanent jobs, according to the Prime Minister. Now, these are missed opportunities. Here, we should have spent it much more systematically, not on tenders where a few entrepreneurs became multimillionaires, but to set off value addition chains in construction, but also around agriculture. Where it's just unbelievable that the green schemes have collapsed so spectacularly when they should have been incubation sites, not only for agricultural production, but also for further processing of those goods. And we must look at that. There is no way of skipping that and to say, let's hope only for some big bang investments to save us. That might be coming, maybe not. But we need to have very concrete initiatives now. And we build a Neckartal Dam at exorbitant costs. But then we say we don't have money to now set up the irrigation scheme and have a massive kind of second hard-up green scheme emerging there. And these are for me also a very worrying thing. How do you spend 5 billion on a dam and then you say, but now we can't use the water and we collect the water to evaporate? This points to very poor planning that we can't afford. If we build such a dam, go all the way and set up the farming ventures around it. And through an industrialization program and that ministry, further processing of those. And as the economy ticks off, as then more people are in jobs, as more taxes are paid, as more value is created, then you have also a kind of backwash, if you like, into the finance ministry in terms of increased revenue creation. So this would be some of the interventions that are needed. And this is all not new. It's been talked about for decades, but why have we not moved to actually do it?
Indeed. Herbert, thank you very much for your time again this time.
Thank you, Taiwo.
Yeah, wonderful. That is Herbert Jauch. He's a labor law expert joining us on the evening review tonight. Thank you for watching.